Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 192, Württemberg, or How to Build a Success, which is also episode 8 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. The counts, dukes, and ultimately kings of Württemberg had risen to the top by winning the genetic lottery. Their eldest sons tended to be competent, some even extremely so. Their wives brought in dowries and sometimes entire counties, and they ruled for long enough that the next generation took over when they were ready. But all that falls apart in the 15th century. They are suddenly afflicted with a disease of dynasties, that states are inherited by babies and buffoons, some of them managing to be both. And that would normally be the death knell for a noble house, but not this time. The Landtag, the Estates of Württemberg, step in to protect the fledgling state, deposing buffoons when necessary and ruling on behalf of the babies. This is one of the lesser known and even more extraordinary political histories of Europe, and one well worth listening to. And as a bonus, we also investigate why the region around Stuttgart, Mannheim, Karlsruhe and Freiburg have become hubs of technology and precision engineering, an area where there was no coal, no mining or any other natural advantage. Except for the wine. No, seriously, it was the wine. But before we start, let me uncork a Nebuchadnezzar of gratitude for all the patrons who keep this show on the road by signing up on historyofthegermans.com/support. And specifically, I want to thank Christian Wenzel, Carrie, Jakob of the Crooked Shade with a big apology for the delayed response to his super nice message, Andreas, Lynn, Stuart Eves, and Kurt, who've already signed up. And then I wanted to point you to another history podcast. Daniele Bolelli's History on Fire has been around for nigh on a decade and has not once lost its footing. Daniele is a university professor, so everything is meticulously researched and sourced. And then there's the drama. He looks for the places where history and epic collide. There's always a lot of passion, humor, and immersive storytelling, with a sprinkle of cooking and martial arts. His recent episodes are about D'Annunzio in Fiume, and it made me hold my breath. The show is History on Fire, and you find it where you found this show. And with that, back to the history of the Germans. Last week, we did not get very far on our journey upriver on the Rhine. We went from Heidelberg via Mannheim to Karlsruhe and Baden-Baden. We passed Speyer without a glance at the largest Romanesque church in the world, but then we'd given it almost an entire episode in July 2021. There was episode 25, Conrad II and the Construction of an Empire. Since we have quite a long journey ahead, we will not spend time climbing up to the castle of Hohenbaden, which was destroyed by the French, or investigating the remains of Baden's Roman baths. Instead, we head straight down south. As we get slowly pulled upriver, we can already see in the distance one of the tallest buildings in Europe, the Cathedral of Strasbourg. The one tower we can see, stretching to 142 meters, had only just been completed. As of right now, i.e. the year 1454, this is not the tallest tower in Christendom. That would be Lincoln Cathedral. When that collapsed in 1549, it was St. Mary's in Stralsund, which fell in 1647, leaving this solitary tower as the tallest thing on earth until in 1847, Hamburg built St. Nikolai, followed by Rouen, Cologne, the Washington Monument, the Eiffel Tower, and so forth, until the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Strasbourg was by far the foremost economic hub of the area, a key element in the wine trade, shipping barrels to England, Scandinavia, and even Poland and Russia. It was the place Gutenberg went to make his millions from pilgrims' mirrors, and soon one of the largest centers of printing and publishing in Europe. Nearby Colmar, too, was a great trading city, and its Unterlinden Museum holds some of the most magnificent late medieval, early Renaissance paintings you'll ever see. And in case you're planning your summer holiday, the food is beyond divine. But that is well known. What is a lot less well known is that the food on the German side of the river, is at least as good. Just 60 kilometers east from Strasbourg Cathedral lies Baiersbronn, a small town of 15,000 souls that can boast 2 3-Michelin star restaurants, 1 2-star restaurant, and in the surrounding area another 4 1-star places. And then, even much more important, 4 Bib Gourmand places. That is more than Chicago. And if you do not know what a Bib Gourmand is, look it up. It will change your life for the better. Given that few restaurant guides have made it down from the 15th century, we do not know where our hungry crew would have gone, but almost certainly the food had been heavenly even then. This is the warmest and most fertile part of modern-day Germany, and if you add in Alsace, probably the agriculturally richest part of northern Europe. And as such, it was able to sustain fairly small political structures that in other areas would have been subsumed by larger neighbors. We talked about the 101 members of the Schwäbischer Reichskreis last week. Many of these were located in the Upper Rhine area, the Black Forest and north of Lake Constance. Where we are now are the lands of the bishops of Strasbourg, one of the larger and richer bishoprics, the cities of Strasbourg, Offenburg, Colmar, Freiburg and Basel, as well as various counts, abbots and knights. The big power looming over all of them was the House of Habsburg, whose ancestral home is not far in the Aargau in modern-day Switzerland. And this area between Freiburg and Constance was known as Further Austria, and the Habsburgs held on to it until Napoleon passed it wholesale to the Grand Dukes of Baden. Further up the Rhine lies the mighty city of Basel, where the great church council, the successor to the Council of Constance, had just closed down in 1449. Once we covered the Council of Constance extensively in episodes 171 to 174, we've only touched upon the one in Basel when we came to the end of the Hussite Wars in episode 183. And with good reason. Basel was not much of a success. We will certainly look at their modest efforts to sort out the decaying Catholic Church when we get to the season on the Reformation. For now, we leave this free imperial city in our rearview mirror as we continue up the gradually narrowing Rhine until our journey is rudely interrupted by waterfalls. These are not exactly the Niagara Falls, but at 23 meters height and a water flow of 600 cubic meters, it makes for a decent enough tourist attraction. What it also does is make the citizens of Schaffhausen rich, as we have to unload all our gear and hire local mariners to take us further. And ever moving forward towards our next stop, Constance, we see looming on our left the Hohen Twil, once home to the Dukes of Swabia, whose power had now vanished so completely. Further on, in the midst of the Untersee, the lower lake, rises the monastery of Reichenau, the place where the undisputedly most artistically significant 10th century illuminations had been produced. By now, this once rich and powerful imperial abbey that controlled the entire surrounding area had fallen on hard times, and the day when the Bishop of Constance took it over was not far. There is no need to describe our next stop, Constance, to you. I did this before in the episodes on the council. So, after a brief rest, we are now turning up north to meet the family that will soon take over the Hohen Twil and much of the land to the north. The Counts of Württemberg, soon Dukes of Württemberg, and ultimately Kings of Württemberg. Now, the Counts of Württemberg were in almost every conceivable aspect the direct opposite of the Markgrafs of Baden. That even begins with the family background. The Markgrafs of Baden can trace themselves reliably back to the House of Zähringen, which goes back to 962 and arguably even beyond. And they have the title to show for it. They were Markgrafs as Markgrafs of Verona since the 11th century, but they had to drop the Verona because, well, they weren't there anymore, but they kept the Markgraf. And a Markgraf was well above a mere count, automatically a direct vassal of the emperor and hence an imperial prince. The House of Württemberg may have had some august lineage. There are some archaeological remains in the ancestral castle in Untertürkheim near Stuttgart that indicate a close link with the Salian house, with Conrad the Red and then Otto of Worms, mentioned in dispatches during episodes 6 and 22. But once the Hohenstaufen had taken over the Duchy of Swabia, these early Württemberg accounts were kept well below the line of sight of history, or may have even died out altogether. I will post a map on the website which shows the possessions of the Hohenstaufen up until 1250. And that shows quite clearly that the area where the Württembergers were based in was Hohenstaufen heartland. The castle called Hohenstaufen was a mere 50 kilometers to their east, and Weiblingen, the place they named themselves after, is literally on the other side of what is today Stuttgart. In other words, the Württemberger had been sucked into the imperial vortex and failed to be seen as loyal vassals worthy of sponsorship, as the House of Baden had been. So, all throughout this period, they kept their head down. They fortified their castle, they took on some minor role in the Hohenstaufen administration, and waited. And waited. Until that opportunity came in 1245, when Emperor Frederick II was excommunicated and an anti-king, Heinrich Raspe, was sponsored by the Pope. Episode 89 following, if you want to catch up with it. Ulrich I of Württemberg teamed up with several other Swabian nobles to take advantage of the situation. When Conrad IV, the son of Emperor Frederick II, went out to confront Heinrich Raspe in battle, Ulrich I and his friends, all of whom had nominally been vassals of the Hohenstaufen, left the camp, leaving young Conrad hanging out to dry. Ulrich then lost no time expanding his territory at the expense of King Conrad IV. It is important to understand how that worked. We are not in the modern age, where a conqueror would attack an enemy stronghold, defeat its garrison, and then replace it with his own new garrison. In the Middle Ages, all these Hohenstaufen strongholds were held by either vassals or ministeriales, not by soldiers subject to military command. Under the feudal law arrangements of the time, a vassal was supporting his lord voluntarily, based on an oath given when he received his fief. And this oath was not unconditional. It could be adjusted or even disregarded if the lord failed in his obligations. The ministeriales, on the other hand, were in principle unfree serfs, trained in warfare, meaning they served under command, not voluntarily. But many of these families of ministeriales had been sitting in their castles for generations. They trained like knights, they lived like knights, they married like knights, and they looked like knights. So they were knights, and as knights they too assumed that they had the freedoms of vassals. What that meant in practical terms was that any vassal or ministeriale who gets attacked has the option to swap sides, or at least he can make an argument that it was legitimate to swap sides. For most of the Hohenstaufen period, very few, if any, Swabian vassals and ministeriales took the option to swap sides and join one of the many enemies of the ducal families. They knew they could rely on the support from the dense networks of other Hohenstaufen vassals and ministeriales, and they also knew that if they surrendered prematurely, the king or emperor may come down later and throw them out of their castle. In 1246, this scenario changed fundamentally. First up, the front of nobles, led by Ulrich von Württemberg, comprised many of the vassals a Hohenstaufen supporter would have expected to come to their aid in case of an attack. And then Frederick II died in 1250. His successor in the role of Duke of Swabia was Conrad IV, who went to Italy in 1251, never to return. The duchy was left in the tiny hands of 2-year-old Conradin. In other words, retribution for abandoning the Stauffer cause became a remote risk. That is why so many ministeriales and vassals opened the gates of their otherwise hard-to-penetrate castles to Ulrich and his friends. In this period, Ulrich acquired the two main seats of the family, Stuttgart and Urach, one by marriage and the other by purchase. But most of his territory he gained by convincing the local vassals and ministeriales to recognize him rather than the baby Duke Conradin. In 1254, Conradin, or more precisely his regents, accepted the gains he had made in exchange for recognizing little Conradin as Duke. Ulrich I ruled the county of Württemberg for a further 11 years, until 1265, continuously expanding his territory. this was not the first, and certainly not the last time, that an ambitious man seized an opportunity to build a princely domain. But for it to become a political structure that endured in the family until 1918 and in its name until today, a couple more things are needed. First up, you need to win the genetic lottery. And not just once, and not just in one way. For the next couple of generations, the family needs to produce competent offspring. But it is not enough to have at least one competent child per generation, but that child also has to be the eldest son. And he needs to live for a very long time to make his successor old enough and well trained enough to take over smoothly. And then that son needs to marry a woman from a family that is losing the genetic lottery, i.e. is dying out. Which then puts the whole thing at risk, because what happens when these less successful genes percolate within the rising family, cutting down either reproduction or competence? And then there's Mr. Mendel mixing things up anyway. You can see how becoming a major territorial dynasty is harder than it looks. The typical staying time is around 10 to 15 generations, which is 250 to 400 years. There's obviously not a lot one can do about these genetic preconditions, but there are a few options that make success more likely. The first thing is to set up a system that prevents the division of territory between the sons. Their northern neighbors, the Counts of Hohenlohe, who had started out on a much stronger position in the 12th century, managed to cut up their territories into more and more separate entities. So you can today walk from the capital of the Principality of Hohenlohe-Niederstetten to their cousin's main residence in Hohenlohe-Weikersheim in a comfortable 90-minute stroll. And in the meantime, you can spot their summer palace along the way. And if you find that too far, you can visit the princely state of Hohenlohe-Bartenstein, which is another cousin, on an even shorter 60-minute walk. The next item on the How to Become a King in the Empire checklist is choose your targets wisely. The vagaries of dynasties dying out, power balances shifting and imperial influence rising and falling, there's a huge temptation to seek acquisitions a long way from home. But that should be avoided. The most successful approach is one of block and tackle. You tackle your neighbor, capture some of his castles and lands, then you block, 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 then you forward, tackle, and again, block, 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 and then again, tackle. By doing that, rather than jumping all across the playing field, picking up territories here and there, you end up with a contiguous piece of land that is much easier to defend. It also raises your profile amongst the other great landowners, the abbots and abbesses. They do require an advocate, a vogt, who protects them against marauding soldiers and greedy neighbors. A powerful lord who happened to be around a lot is a great choice as vogt. So, how did the Württemberger do? First up, they mostly lived and ruled for a very long time. Ulrich I, 24 years, his successor Ulrich II, 14 years, Eberhard I, 46 years, Ulrich III, 19 years, Eberhard II, 53 years, Eberhard III, 25 years. That's pretty impressive. But what is even more impressive is that they were all pretty competent. They established primogeniture very much from the days of Ulrich I. There were situations where younger brothers wanted a division of the territory, but for now that could be avoided. Then the Württemberger either deliberately or by chance placed hardly any of their male offspring into church rolls. So, if an older brother got knocked out in the game of whack-a-mole, the younger one and his son could take over. As for the game of block and tackle, they did well, at least in their core territory. Their lands became a coherent block around the cities of Stuttgart, Tübingen and Urach. They even built a defensive border against the Palatinate, the Württembergische Landgraben. Border defenses were rare, since lands were usually far too fragmented for such efforts to make any sense. They existed around major free imperial cities, like Rothenburg ob der Tauber and Schwäbisch Hall, but rarely around princely territories. This wall also acted as a customs barrier, which was one of the Count's most important sources of funds. From the late 13th and then again in the late 14th century, their progress south ran into an even larger and even more coherent political entity, the House of Habsburg. With the north blocked by the Palatinate and the east by the Bavarians, they looked west, leapfrogging the Badenian cousins and digging into Alsace. Lorraine, too, came into view. Until in 1397, Count Eberhard IV married Henrietta, sole heiress of the county of Mömpelgard, or Montbéliard in France. That territory between Besançon and Mulhouse had once been part of the Kingdom of Burgundy and therefore had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. By 1397, when the House of Württemberg took it over, it was half imperial and half subject to the Dukes of Burgundy, causing no end of complications. Montbéliard will remain under Württemberg control until the French Revolution. If this was the first deviation from the game plan for total domination, things got derailed further when the family no longer won the genetic lottery. Yes, there was still at least one extraordinarily competent heir to come, but what was needed was consistency. Not every one of them had to be a genius living until he was 60. It's more important to keep the babies and the buffoons to a minimum. Spoiler alert, lots of babies and lots of buffoons coming up. The calamities started with the early death of Eberhard IV, the husband of Henrietta of Mömpelgard. Their sons were both minors. So Henrietta led the regency government that was dominated by the local nobility. Once her sons had grown up, they proceeded to split the territory into two. One centered on Urach, one centered on Stuttgart. Count Ulrich V of Württemberg-Stuttgart is the same one we met last week, the one who was defeated in single combat at the Battle of Seckenheim. Following this misadventure, Ulrich V and his state were essentially bankrupt. But at least he wasn't dead. His brother Ludwig II lasted 9 years as the sole ruler of his half of Württemberg, and then he died, leaving behind 2 sons who were minors. So, regency fell to his wife, Mechthild of the Palatinate, the sister of our friend Friedrich der Siegreiche, and the driving force behind the foundation of Freiburg and Tübingen University. In 1453, her eldest son reached maturity. But since that son suffered from epilepsy, he was considered unable to rule, so the regency continued for another 5 years. In this vacuum of an incapacitated ruler in Urach and a bankrupt one in Stuttgart stepped Friedrich der Siegreiche. He exerted influence through his sister, the regent in Urach, and through his financial hold over the bankrupt Ulrich V. Württemberg was again at risk of being sucked into the vortex of a more powerful state, this time the Palatinate. Cometh the time, cometh the Landtag. At this crucial point, it is not a man or a woman that gets up to protect the independence of Württemberg. It is an institution. And this institution is the Landtag, the Estates of Württemberg. To explain, we have to look at one more criteria for a successful territorial state: the sense of communal purpose, or you can call it territorial nationalism. In principle, a territorial state is nothing other than a collection of properties that happen to be under the control of just one person. But as these territories developed, some rulers managed to instill a sense of belonging to their territory. Much of that came into being during the 14th and 15th century, and it lasts until today. Germans who identify as Hessen, Badener, Sachsen, Hannoveraner, or Preußen are referencing a territory created not by geography, ethnology, or ancient culture, but a random collection of lands owned by a single family. And still, it is a very strong sentiment. My grandfather, who was from Baden, would every year celebrate the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866 as the last day you were legally allowed to shoot at Prussians. And Württemberg was one of the territories that developed such a sense of belonging and territorialism, earlier and stronger than many others. That was in part a function of the contiguous territory. But it had also to do with the interior structure of Württemberg. Other than their neighbors in Baden, the Württembergs liked to have cities. They liked the economic power they brought, and since most of their income came from customs stations along the main north-south trading route from Italy to the Rhine, they had an interest in their prosperity. Many of these cities had become free imperial cities after the Hohenstaufen had fallen. So, to incorporate them into Württemberg over time, the counts waged war against them. When they succeeded, the peace settlement often included the right of the city to participate in the state decisions. So from 1316 onwards, we know that 8 cities sent their delegates to the Landtag, the meeting of the Estates of Württemberg, to advise and support the count. The strategy towards nobility was somewhat opposite. The counts tried at any time to suppress them, force them to become subjects rather than vassals, and where that failed, left them outside the operations of the state. The Landtag became the glue that kept Württemberg together during this period when the land was divided between the two lines and ruled by ineffective counts. They really stepped into the limelight in 1457, when the epileptic Count Ludwig II of Württemberg-Urach died. His younger brother Eberhard V was now Count, but he was only 12 years old. His bankrupt uncle, Ulrich V of the Stuttgart branch, became his guardian and de facto ruler of the combined entity. But in reality he was a puppet of Friedrich of the Palatinate, and if you remember the episode on the Palatinate, such a scenario could easily end in the sudden demise of young Eberhard V and a takeover of Württemberg first by Ulrich V and then by the Palatinate. So to push back the Palatinate, the Landtag staged a coup. Against the wishes of his guardian, the representatives of the cities declared Eberhard V of age. Ulrich failed to raise the resources to suppress the Landtag and had to withdraw. Eberhard V, called Im Barte, turned out to be one of the most competent of the family. He fostered economic activity, he founded the University of Tübingen, married an immensely rich Italian heiress, and reformed the bureaucracy. On the negative side of his account sheet stood the expulsion and the arrest of the Jews in Württemberg. His main objective was to reverse the division of the territory. In 1482 he achieved that by making a deal with the son of Ulrich V and the heir to the Stuttgart branch. The two territories would be rejoined. The childless Eberhard Im Barte would run it until his death, and afterwards the whole thing would go to the son of Ulrich, called Eberhard the Younger. After this success, Eberhard Im Barte's Württemberg reached an extent and wealth that is not only rivaled but superseded many duchies. In 1495, Eberhard Im Barte was elevated from count to duke, and with that the Duchy of Württemberg was born. The duchy was made indivisible, and succession was based on strict primogeniture. And part of that was also that within the duchy, the Landtag, the Estates of Württemberg, gained an important role. They were now consulted on all decisions over war and peace, and most importantly, they retained the right to approve new taxes. They were even granted the right to resist the duke in case he breached any of the arrangements. In terms of membership, there were 14 abbots of the main monasteries, 13 knights and nobles, and 120 representatives of the cities. So the voting was not by estates, which means not as it would normally be that there would be one vote for the prelates, one for the nobles, and one for the commoners. Instead, all representatives voted together. That, and the unwillingness of the nobles and abbots to pay any taxes, shifted the power in the assembly towards the commoners, who were mainly the patricians in the cities. Eberhard Im Barte died in 1496, a year after the creation of the duchy. His heir was, as agreed, Eberhard the Younger, the son of Ulrich V. This Eberhard was no longer young. He was in fact already a fairly old man, 49 years when he took over. When he had handed over the control of his share of the duchy to Eberhard im Barte, he had not only gained the right to inherit the whole, but he had also received a generous annual pension. Free from dealing with boring admin tasks, he spent his life traveling, picking up expensive habits at the courts of France and Burgundy. So when he took over in 1496, he was remarkably ill-suited for the management of a complex duchy in a crossfire between Habsburg and princely interests. And given his love of bling, he almost instantly clashed with the estates, with the Landtag. He demanded more money for his court, his mistresses, and an army. The Landtag refused. Words were had. And then, in a completely unprecedented move, the Landtag deposed Duke Eberhard II of Württemberg. The state apparatus, the councillors, administrators, bureaucrats, and armed forces agreed. Eberhard II had to flee to Ulm. From there, he appealed to the emperor to put this rebellious rebel under the interdict. The emperor responded by siding with the Landtag and installed a new duke, Ulrich I, who was, again, a minor. But instead of having a regency council made up of nobles, it was a government made up of members of the Landtag, some prelates and nobles, but mainly commoners, who ruled the duchy until young Ulrich was 16. Ulrich started out as a great hero, gaining victories in the War of the Landshut Succession in 1504 that restored all the losses the duchy had sustained during the Mainzer Stiftsfehde. But things then gradually went sideways. Ulrich, like many Renaissance princes, enjoyed the good life, and he felt compelled to show off. His spending on feasts and feuds drained the coffers of the state. In 1513 he had given major concessions to the Landtag to get them to approve another tax. And this tax triggered a revolt. This revolt, called the Revolt of the Poor Conrad, spread like wildfire across the land of Württemberg. To suppress it, Ulrich had to again seek help from the Landtag. But then a subsection of the Landtag, a group of roughly 60 interconnected patrician families, had formed an association they called the Ehrbarkeit, best translated as the Honorables. The Ehrbarkeit was willing to bear the cost of the military campaign and pay off all the duke's debts in exchange for some further concessions. On July 8th, 1514, Duke Ulrich signed the Tübinger Vertrag, the Magna Carta of Swabia. In it, he guaranteed the Landtag's rights to decide taxes. They were given influence on decisions over war and peace, and they could refuse the sale of any ducal territory. Inhabitants of Württemberg were given the right to due process and the right to emigrate freely. They were no longer any serfs. And then Ulrich did another thing, most inadvertently, to cement the new order. In 1515 he went out hunting with his equerry, Hans von Hutten. Von Hutten had married one of Ulrich's mistresses, and when the Duke demanded that Hutten would take a back seat in the marriage, Hutten refused. Hutten then did the honorable thing. He resigned his role as equerry and planned to leave Stuttgart with his wife. Ulrich invited him to come on one last hunting trip just to reconcile their differences. Hutten could not refuse and arrived in light hunting gear to find the Duke showing up in full armor. Once they reached the forest, the Duke sent away his staff and then went after von Hutten. He chased him around a tree, striking him with his sword several times, 5 of which in the back, and then he strung him up with his own belt. That was the scandal that broke the camel's back. 18 of his vassals revoked their oaths. His wife left him. Hutten's family sued him in the imperial courts. The poet Ulrich von Hutten, a cousin of the victim, wrote immensely powerful satirical pamphlets about the Duke. Ulrich was placed under the imperial ban. Then in 1519 the Swabian League invaded Württemberg and Duke Ulrich had to flee into exile. He stayed there until he was restored by force of arms in 1534. For 15 years the duchy was again ruled by the Landtag, led by commoners, members of the Ehrbarkeit. When Ulrich returned, he had to confirm the rights of the Landtag and the Ehrbarkeit. A political structure with a prince constrained by the tax-raising authority of the estates was not that unusual, not even in the 14th, 15th or 16th century. Most territorial states had these. So did in fact France and obviously England. Where Württemberg differed was in A. the composition of the estates, i.e. being dominated not by the nobility but by the cities and even at some point by peasants and ordinary people. B. in the fact that it retained full control over taxation even during a time when most others succumbed to absolutism. And C. it differed in the sense that it granted rights directly to ordinary citizens, in particular the right of due process. The rest of Württemberg's history, which I am sure we will touch upon as we go through the next few centuries, were dominated by the conflict between Duke and Ehrbarkeit. Dukes tried to suppress it or get past through imaginative financial shenanigans, but in the end, all of these attempts failed. The Landtag and within it the power of the Ehrbarkeit stayed on until 1805. Which gets me to the third and last topic for today. We talked about what it takes for somewhat obscure nobles to become important imperial princes. We talked about how a territory developed its own identity and political structure beyond being just a collection of rights in the hand of one man. And finally, we're now going to talk about the reasons for the economic success of Württemberg. If you ask any Brit to name a German city other than Berlin or Munich, Stuttgart comes up surprisingly often. It's odd, because neither the clubbing scene nor the Christmas markets are much different to the rest of the country. The Cannstatter Vasen may be almost as old and almost as large as the Oktoberfest, but few people outside Germany, arguably outside Swabia, had ever heard of it. The reason Baden-Württemberg is so well known is the extraordinary cluster of high-end manufacturing in the place. Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, Bosch, ZF Friedrichshafen, SAP, Heckler & Koch, as well as dozens and dozens of engineering and technology companies are based there. Why they are there today? Well, that's self-evident. There's a skilled workforce, some excellent technical universities, physical infrastructure, and suppliers of key components nearby. The companies are competing fiercely against each other, spurning each other to become better and better, while serving a customer base that demands to drive safely at 130 miles around corners. But the question remains, why did they come here in the first place? Yes, Carl Benz patented the first motor car in Ladenburg near Mannheim, and Gottlieb Daimler, together with Wilhelm Maybach, created effective engines and later motor cars in Stuttgart. Ferdinand Porsche had worked at Daimler in Stuttgart before he set up his own firm in the city. But inventors' personal affinity to a location is rarely enough for industry clusters to emerge. If you look at the early industrial centers in Europe, they're often driven by natural resources: water energy in the English Midlands, coal and iron ore in the Ruhr, Wallonia and Lorraine. Mining in particular can be a catalyst, as it had been in the Ore Mountains in Saxony and Thuringia. And that is not just because of the material they dig up, but also the technologies required bring about specializations and skills that can then be deployed elsewhere. And neither Baden nor Württemberg had much, if any, coal, mining, or came in early enough to take advantage of water-based energy. Now, another driver can be capital. Large cities tended to be places full of rich people, some of whom might be willing to support entrepreneurs. So you find industries spring up in Cologne or Berlin. But Stuttgart, Mannheim, Heidelberg and Karlsruhe were all mid-sized towns, not metropolises full of venture capitalists. What the region could call upon were the universities. Not just the old foundations in Heidelberg, Freiburg and Tübingen, but also the technical universities in Karlsruhe, founded in 1825, in Stuttgart, founded in 1829. The Tübinger Vertrag had guaranteed due process since 1514, and the rule of law was further strengthened in the comparatively liberal constitutions of the post-Napoleonic period. As we talked about before, the rule of law is an important facilitator of economic growth, It reassures investors that they can get their money back and entrepreneurs that they will be benefiting from the fruits of their labors. Some argue the fact that Baden and Württemberg were mid-sized states made careers in politics and military unattractive, and so ambitious people who wanted to change the world would not find a large enough stage in Karlsruhe or Stuttgart. Hence they directed their efforts into areas like science and engineering, where territorial borders are largely irrelevant. And finally, we have, or may have, another major contributor to the success story, one that is very close to my heart: wine. If you compare maps of ancient wine-growing regions and areas of technological innovation in Baden-Württemberg, you see a very clearly discernible overlap. This triggered two scholars, Thilo Huning and Fabian Wahl from the universities of York and Vienna, to investigate why that may be the case. They produced a paper just 2 months ago arguing that wine growing had a material impact on modern economic development in Baden-Württemberg. I will put a link to the article in the show notes for this episode, but here is what I understand to be their main line of argument. The first point is that in areas where wine was grown, the tradition of sharing inheritance equally could be retained. We should remember that parents basically love each of their children equally, and that leaving all the assets to just one on the grounds of seniority or gender is unnatural. This idea is only adopted out of necessity. So in regions where productivity per acre is low and hence dividing the farm between several children would make each of them unviable, that is where primogeniture takes hold. Henry the Fowler introduced primogeniture in the Kingdom of East Francia, not out of spite for his younger son, but in order to preserve the viability of his state. And the same goes for the Counts and Dukes of Württemberg. In the wine-growing areas of Baden and Württemberg, we find mostly equal inheritance rights. The issue with wine growing is that it is extremely labor-intensive, 7 to 8 times greater relative to grains. And wage labor is fairly scarce in the wine industry because vines can be easily and permanently damaged in the pruning, ploughing and hoeing operations if they are badly carried out. Hence, these had to be family businesses. Moreover, wine is as much about quality as it is about volume, meaning that relatively small plots, if well tended, can sustain a family, which in turn means there is less need to establish primogeniture, forcing younger siblings to fight for themselves. The labor intensity and egalitarian inheritance rules resulted in a higher population density in wine-growing areas at the dawn of industrialization. This provided the necessary excess labor force that was also flexible enough to go back to the vineyard when an entrepreneurial venture had failed. As an aside, wine was also a very expensive commodity, allowing merchants in the wine trading cities to make huge profits and build up significant capital, and that capital could then be mobilized as venture capital. Available, flexible labor and capital are important factors, but there is something else wine-growing areas benefit from. Wine growing is a gamble, creating the need to share the risks. You have a perennial plant that takes decades to reach top quality production, meaning you have no flexibility in terms of crop. And then it is extremely susceptible to any kind of change in the weather. Finally, if the markets shift, you cannot just willy-nilly replace vines with rye. So, when times are tough, you have to take it on the chin. But since your neighbors go through the same hardship, wine-growing villages develop a closer sense of community and an ethos of mutual support. And that also manifests in the good days. Whilst growing grapes itself is not capital intensive, a wine press, the barrels and the cellars are. Wine growers have always and still often do share these costs in the form of collectives. This requires coordination, compromise, and the development of trust between the members of society. In other words, in wine-growing areas, society is more collectivist, a place where people are willing to cooperate and share resources, both in good and in bad times. These attributes create trust in individuals and in the community as a whole. Trust is one of the most valuable commodities. When trust is absent, society wastes valuable resources on verification, monitoring, and enforcement mechanisms that could otherwise be directed towards productive activities. And all these costs fall away when people trust each other, making the allocation of resources much more efficient. The World Bank estimates that 60 to 80% of the wealth of developed nations is made up of social and institutional capital, i.e., is based in the trust that individuals and institutions are broadly acting fairly. Now, that figure is heavily disputed, but it is not a long shot to believe that a tradition of working collectively and supporting each other makes challenges easier to overcome and saves a ton of money on lawyers, forensic accountants, party donations, and lobbyists. Now, our two scholars, Thilo Huning and Fabian Wahl, are scientists. They deal in facts, not beliefs. So, they measured the correlation between wine growing and economic activity in Baden-Württemberg down to the level of the individual municipality. They collected data on wine growing in the 9th and 17th century, as well as meteorological conditions, and compared those to population density, density of firms, nighttime luminosity, distribution of rare given names, and other various control variables. Now, I'm not very good with the Greeks they come up with, but their conclusion is, quote, "This study underscores the role of wine in shaping of modern southwest Germany." Bingo. So, if you want to lay the foundations of economic growth in the long run in a wine-growing area of your choice, get yourself a few bottles and bask in the glow of general goodness. You get that same feeling, by the way, if you sign up on historyofthegermans.com/support. And with that, see you next week.